The gymnasium fell silent as Brandon Lee's hand hovered inches from the mat. His shoulder blades pressed against the cold surface, while 1,700 people held their breath. The overhead lights buzzed like angry hornets, casting harsh shadows. Across the wrestling mat where 2 decades of dreams were about to die in a single, devastating moment, his mind raced through every practice, every sacrifice, every promise he'd made to his father about bringing home that state championship trophy. While across from him, Tommy Castellano's grip tightened like a steel trap around his wrist. The scoreboard glowed 4-4 with 30 seconds left in the 185-pound Iowa State Championship final. And Brandon could feel his hometown of Cedar Falls watching from the bleachers, their hopes riding on his shoulders like a weight he couldn't bear. To drop, 20 years later, he'd still wake up in cold sweats, feeling that mat against his back and hearing the referee's whistle that changed everything. But failure has a way of reshaping a man's soul, turning defeat into obsession, and obsession into a kind of madness that spans generations. Brandon Lee would discover that some battles aren't meant to be won on the mat, and some victories come disguised as the very losses that destroy us. This is the story of a man who lost everything at 18, spent 20 years preparing for a rematch that would never come, and found redemption in the most unexpected place of all. Hello my friends, before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Cedar Falls, Iowa, had the kind of small-town charm that postcards tried to capture, but never quite managed. With its tree-lined streets and the Cedar River winding through downtown like a lazy snake, the smell of cornfields mixed with the industrial hum from the John Deere plant, where most fathers worked long shifts to keep their families fed and their sons in wrestling shoes. It was 1987, and in this corner of the Midwest, Friday nights belonged to football, but winter evenings were sacred to the ancient art of wrestling. The high school gymnasium would pack with farmers and factory workers, their calloused hands gripping coffee cups while they watched their boys battle for something more valuable than trophies. Brandon Lee's father, Mickey, had been a decent wrestler in his day, good enough to make it to state, but not good enough to win it. And that unfinished business haunted him like a ghost that whispered promises in the dark. Mickey Lee ran the local auto shop with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and a dream that lived in his chest like a burning coal. Every night after work, he'd drive his rusted Chevy to the school to watch his son practice. Standing in the shadows of the wrestling room, where the air hung thick with sweat and determination, wrestling builds character, he'd tell anyone who'd listen, but what he really meant was that wrestling offered redemption. Brandon was built for the sport, lean and wiry with quick hands and an engine that never seemed to quit. But more importantly, he had that hunger that can't be taught. At 15, he was already making varsity, and by junior year, he was the kind of wrestler that opposing coaches would lose sleep over. The kid had something special, something that reminded Mickey of what he could have been if he'd just wanted it a little more. The first time Brandon met Tommy Castellano, it was at a tournament in Des Moines, and the Italian kid from the east side made an impression that would last a lifetime. Tommy wrestled with a cockiness that bordered on arrogance, talking trash between periods and flexing for the crowd like he was performing on Broadway instead of grappling on a mat. He was everything Brandon wasn't: loud, flashy, and blessed, with the kind of natural athleticism that made difficult moves look effortless. Their first match went the distance, with Tommy winning 7-5 on a late takedown that left Brandon staring at the ceiling lights and wondering what the hell had just happened. In the handshake line afterward, Tommy had leaned close enough to whisper, "Better luck next time, farm boy," and Brandon felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach like a stone. The rivalry grew through their senior seasons like a wildfire, fed by newspaper articles and the kind of anticipation that makes small towns forget their troubles. Brandon would spend hours studying film of Tommy's matches, learning every fake, every setup, every weakness that might give him an edge when they met again. Their second encounter ended in Brandon's favor, 3-2 in overtime, and the victory felt like drinking lightning. But Tommy got the last laugh at regionals, pinning Brandon in the second period with a move so perfectly executed that even Brandon's supporters had to nod in grudging admiration. The loss ate at Brandon like acid, but it also motivated him in ways he'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving that hard work and heart could overcome talent and flashdot as the state tournament approached. The entire town of Cedar Falls seemed to hold its breath. With signs appearing in store windows and the local newspaper running daily updates on Brandon's training, Mickey closed the auto shop early so he could drive to every practice, watching his son prepare for what they both knew would be the defining moment of their lives. The pressure was everywhere. In the way neighbors stopped to ask about Brandon's shoulder, in the way his mother cooked his favorite meals without being asked, in the way his teammates looked at him like he was carrying their hopes along with his own. Brandon felt it all, but he also felt ready, like everything in his 18 years had led to this single moment on a mat in Des Moines. The championship was more than a trophy. It was validation, legacy, and the fulfillment of a promise that had been whispered in wrestling rooms for generations. But pressure has a way of revealing character, and sometimes that revelation isn't what anyone expects. Brandon had trained for every possible scenario except the one that would actually unfold. And in the quiet hours before dawn, he'd lie awake, wondering if wanting something too much could actually make it slip through your fingers. The wrestling gods, it seemed, had a sense of humor darker than Iowa winter nights. And they were about to teach a farm kid from Cedar Falls a lesson that would echo through decades. Some dreams come true, and some dreams become the obsessions that define us long after the final whistle has blown. ****. The Iowa State Wrestling Tournament descended upon Des Moines like a religious revival, transforming the Veterans Memorial Auditorium into a cathedral of combat where teenage gladiators would battle for immortality. Brandon arrived with the Cedar Falls team on a yellow school bus that smelled like sweat and nervous energy, his headphones pumping metallic while he stared out the window at the city skyline. The tournament bracketed the state's best wrestlers into a single elimination gauntlet, where one mistake could end for years of dreams in the span of a heartbeat. Mickey had driven separately, his trunk loaded with video equipment and a notebook filled with 20 years of wrestling wisdom that he'd tried to download into his son's brain. The weight of expectation sat heavy on Brandon's shoulders, but so did the confidence that comes from knowing you've prepared for this moment your entire life. The preliminary matches felt like a blur of controlled violence, with Brandon dismantling opponent after opponent with the kind of technical precision that made wrestling look like a science experiment. His first victim was a kid from Waterloo who'd made the mistake of trying to outmuscle him, only to find himself on his back within the first minute. The second match lasted longer, but Brandon's conditioning showed as he wore down a scrappy fighter from Council Bluffs who'd built his reputation on never giving up. By the semifinals, the crowd had begun to buzz with the kind of anticipation that comes when they realize they're witnessing something special. Brandon's parents sat in the bleachers wearing matching Cedar Falls wrestling t-shirts, his mother clutching a rosary she'd pulled from her purse, while Mickey filmed every second with the intensity of a documentary filmmaker. The semi-final match would go down as one of the greatest in tournament history. A back-and-forth war with a kid from Dubuque who'd been wrestling since he could walk. They traded takedowns and reversals like heavyweight boxers exchanging punches, neither willing to give an inch in a battle that had the crowd on its feet for all 6 minutes. Brandon found himself down 8-6 with 30 seconds left, his lungs burning and his legs screaming for mercy, when something primal kicked in. He shot a double-leg takedown with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for shore, lifting his opponent off the ground and driving him to the mat with enough force to shake the entire building. The 2-point takedown tied the match, and Brandon's escape in the final seconds gave him the 9-8 victory that would haunt his dreams for decades to come. As Brandon celebrated with his teammates, Tommy Castellano was putting on a clinic in the other semifinal, toying with his opponent like a cat playing with a wounded mouse. The Italian kid from the east side had grown stronger since their last meeting, his shoulders broader and his confidence bordering on arrogance as he posed for the crowd after every scoring sequence. Tommy's father, a thick-necked man who'd wrestled collegiately at Iowa, watched from the stands with the kind of satisfied smile that comes from knowing your son is about to achieve everything you'd dreamed of. The contrast between the two fathers was stark. Mickey Lee, humble and hardworking, filming every moment like it might be his last, while Sal Castellano strutted around the arena like he owned the place, slapping backs and making predictions about his son's inevitable victory. The hours between the semi-final and the championship match felt like a lifetime. With Brandon trying to stay loose while his mind raced through every possible scenario, he'd watched film of Tommy's recent matches, noting the subtle improvements in technique and the way he'd learned to use his length advantage more effectively. The kid was good, maybe even great. But Brandon had something Tommy didn't: the burning need to prove that heart could overcome talent. Mickey pulled his son aside in the warm-up area, his voice barely above a whisper, as he delivered the kind of speech that fathers give when they know their words might be remembered forever. "You've got nothing to prove to anyone but yourself," he said, his calloused hand squeezing Brandon's shoulder. "Win or lose, you're still my son, and I'm proud of the man you've become." But even as Mickey spoke those words, both father and son knew that losing wasn't really an option. Not with the entire town watching and 20 years of dreams hanging in the balance. The championship match would be broadcast live on local television, with reporters from Des Moines and Cedar Falls ready to chronicle the crowning of Iowa's newest wrestling hero. Brandon could feel the weight of history pressing down on him like a physical force. The knowledge that everything he'd worked for would be decided in 6 minutes of combat that would echo through generations. The calling had brought him to this moment, and now all that remained was to answer it with everything he had. Some callings, however, come with a price that can't be calculated until the bill comes due. The championship match began like a chess game played at hyperspeed, with Brandon and Tommy circling each other in the center of the mat, while 1,700 spectators held their breath. The first period was a masterclass in technique, both wrestlers probing for weaknesses that might not exist. Their movements sharp and calculated, like surgeons operating on each other's dreams. Brandon struck first with a beautiful ankle pick. That caught Tommy off guard, diving low and lifting the leg while his opponent scrambled to maintain balance. The takedown sent shockwaves through the Cedar Falls section, but Tommy's escape came so quickly that Brandon barely had time to celebrate. By the end of the first period, they were tied 2-2, and both wrestlers knew they were in for the fight of their lives. The second period saw the pace intensify as both athletes began to feel the pressure of the moment, their movements becoming more desperate and less controlled. Tommy chose bottom position and immediately began working his signature stand-up. The same move that had beaten Brandon at regionals, but this time Brandon was ready. He rode Tommy like a cowboy breaking a bronco, his hands locked around the waist while he fought to keep his opponent grounded. The crowd was on its feet, sensing that something special was happening. While coaches from both corners screamed instructions that were lost in the noise, Tommy finally broke free with a reversal that showcased his superior strength. But Brandon answered with an escape that tied the match at 4-4 heading into the final period. The third period would become the stuff of legend. 6 minutes of pure intensity that would be talked about in wrestling rooms for generations. Brandon started on bottom, his face pressed against the mat while Tommy's weight settled on his back like a lead blanket. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but Brandon had trained for this moment his entire life, and he wasn't about to quit now. His escape came with a burst of energy that surprised even him. A quick hip heave that created just enough space to slip away from Tommy's grasp. The crowd erupted as Brandon spun to face his opponent. Both wrestlers tied at 5-5 with 3 minutes left to determine the state champion. What happened next would replay in Brandon's mind for the next 20 years, a sequence of events so perfectly orchestrated that it felt like destiny unfolding in real time. Tommy shot a double-leg takedown with the kind of commitment that left no room for error. His head driving into Brandon's midsection while his arms wrapped around both legs. Brandon sprawled with everything he had, his hips driving down while His hands fought to break Tommy's grip, but the Italian kid was stronger than he remembered. They crashed to the mat in a tangle of arms and legs, Tommy on top and in control, when Brandon saw his opportunity. It was a move he'd practiced 1,000 times, a simple hip toss that required perfect timing and total commitment. Was beautiful in its execution, a textbook example of leverage overcoming strength. And for a moment, it looked like Brandon had turned certain defeat into miraculous victory. Tommy flew through the air like a rag doll, his body rotating in a perfect arc that would have scored 2 points and given Brandon the lead he needed. But wrestling is a sport of inches, and sometimes those inches make all the difference in the world. As Tommy's shoulders approached the mat, his hands shot out instinctively to break his fall, and in that split second, Brandon's grip shifted just enough to change the angle of the throw. Instead of landing on his back, Tommy rolled through and caught Brandon in a cradle that was so sudden and so perfect that even the referees seemed surprised. The arena fell silent as Brandon found himself trapped in Tommy's arms. His shoulders pressed against the mat while the referee slapped the surface to signal a pin. 20 years of dreams died in that moment, along with the promises Brandon had made to his father and the expectations of an entire town. The final whistle seemed to echo forever, a sound that would haunt Brandon's dreams and turn victory into the obsession that would define the rest of his life. As Tommy celebrated with his teammates, Brandon lay motionless on the mat, staring at the ceiling lights and wondering how perfection could transform into failure in the space of a heartbeat. The 20 years that followed the championship match passed like a fever dream, with Brandon unable to escape the ghost of that final moment when victory had slipped through his fingers. He'd tried college wrestling at Iowa State, but the fire that had burned so bright in high school had been extinguished by that single devastating loss. And he'd quit the team after his sophomore year. Marriage to his high school sweetheart, Sarah, had provided some stability, but even she couldn't understand the way he'd wake up at night, his body drenched in sweat and his mind replaying that perfect throw that had somehow become his downfall. The auto shop that Mickey had passed down to him became both sanctuary and prison, a place where Brandon could work with his hands while his mind wandered to what might have been. The obsession had started innocently enough, with Brandon volunteering to help coach the high school wrestling team as a way to stay connected to the sport that had defined his youth. But what began as casual assistance had evolved into something darker. A single-minded focus on techniques and strategies that might have changed the outcome of that championship match. He'd studied every frame of video from that night, dissecting the sequence that had led to his defeat with the intensity of a detective investigating a murder. The other coaches had initially welcomed his knowledge, but they'd grown uncomfortable with the way he'd fixate on specific moves, drilling them over and over until the wrestlers complained about the repetition. Everything changed when Sarah gave birth to their son, Michael, and Brandon saw in the baby's eyes a second chance at the redemption that had eluded him. From the moment Michael could walk, Brandon had him in the wrestling room, teaching him the basics of stance and movement with the kind of patience that comes from having all the time in the world. The boy was a natural athlete, blessed with his father's quickness and his mother's determination, but more importantly, he had the kind of coachability that made learning look effortless. By the time Michael was in middle school, he was already dominating tournaments, and Brandon began to see the outline of a plan that would take decades to unfold. The revelation came during Michael's freshman year, when Brandon discovered that Tommy Castellano had also returned to Iowa and was coaching his own son, Tony, at a rival high school across the state. The news hit Brandon like a physical blow, awakening feelings he'd thought were buried forever. And suddenly, the obsession had a new focus. He'd drive hours to watch Tony wrestle, studying the boy's technique and looking for weaknesses that might give Michael an advantage when they inevitably met. The kid was good, maybe even better than his father had been. But Brandon was convinced that with the right preparation and the right strategy, his son could succeed where he had failed. The next 4 years became a blur of training camps and private lessons, with Brandon investing every dollar he could spare in Michael's development. He'd hired former college wrestlers to provide specialized instruction, driven to tournaments across the Midwest to find the best competition, and transformed the family garage into a wrestling room that rivaled anything at the high school level. Sarah had initially supported her husband's dedication, but she'd grown concerned about the way Brandon's entire identity had become wrapped up in their son's success. "He's not you," she'd tell him during their increasingly frequent arguments. But Brandon couldn't see the difference anymore. The breaking point came during Michael's junior year, when father and son were watching film of Tony Castellano's latest match, and Brandon began his familiar critique of techniques and strategies. "You see how he drops his right hand after the shot?" Brandon said, his voice taking on the obsessive quality that had become his trademark. "That's where you attack. That's where you make him pay for his father's arrogance." Michael had looked at his father with a mixture of love and concern, and, in that moment, Brandon saw himself clearly for the first time in 20 years. The obsession had consumed him, turning what should have been a father's love into something twisted and unhealthy. Asterisk. The revelation that followed was both painful and liberating, as Brandon realized that he'd been training his son not to be a champion, but to be his instrument of revenge. The rematch he'd been preparing for would never come, because it had already happened every day for 2 decades in the wrestling room of his mind. Some battles, Brandon finally understood, aren't meant to be won on the mat. And some victories come disguised as the losses that teach us who we really are. The hardest lesson of all was learning that redemption couldn't be inherited, and that the love of a father should never be conditional on the outcome of a wrestling match. The state wrestling tournament had returned to Des Moines like a familiar dream, with Michael Lee entering as the #1 seed in the 185-pound division, and carrying the hopes of a town that remembered his father's heartbreak 20 years earlier. The Veterans Memorial Auditorium looked exactly the same, with its harsh fluorescent lights and the same smell of sweat and nervous energy that had haunted Brandon's memories for 2 decades. But this time, Brandon sat in the stands as a spectator, rather than a competitor, watching his son warm up with a mixture of pride and terror that made his hands shake. Michael had grown into the kind of wrestler that coaches dreamed about. Technically sound and mentally tough, but Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that history was about to repeat itself in the cruelest possible way. The path to the championship had been everything Brandon had planned, and more. With Michael dismantling opponent after opponent with a kind of efficiency that made wrestling look like a science experiment. His semi-final match had been a masterpiece of technique. A 12-2 technical fall that had the crowd on its feet and the sportswriters reaching for superlatives. But across the arena, Tony Castellano was putting on an equally impressive show. His combination of his father's flashiness and his own improved technique making him look unstoppable. The championship match would be a collision of legacies, with 2 sons carrying the dreams and baggage of fathers who'd never been able to let go of their own teenage heartbreak. The hours before the championship match felt like a nightmare, with Brandon unable to eat or sit still while his mind raced through every possible scenario. He'd spotted Tommy Castellano in the crowd, the years having been kind to the former champion, and the 2 men had nodded at each other with the kind of acknowledgement that comes from shared experience. Sarah sat beside Brandon, her hand occasionally reaching for his when the anxiety became too much, while Michael went through his pre-match routine with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've prepared for this moment your entire life. The weight of 20 years of obsession pressed down on Brandon like a physical force, and he realized that he was more nervous than he'd ever been during his own matches. The championship match began with both wrestlers feeling each other out, their movements careful and calculated as they searched for the opening that would determine their fate. Michael struck first with a beautiful double-leg takedown that reminded Brandon of his own technique. But Tony's escape came so quickly that it barely registered on the scoreboard. The first period was a chess match played at hyperspeed, with both wrestlers displaying the kind of technical mastery that made their father's generation look primitive by comparison. By the end of the first period, they were tied 3-3, and Brandon found himself gripping the bleacher so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The second period saw the pace intensify as both athletes began to feel the pressure of the moment, their movements becoming more urgent and less controlled. Michael chose bottom position and immediately began working his signature stand-up. The same move that had served him well throughout the tournament, but Tony was ready. The Italian kid rode Michael like his father had ridden Brandon 20 years earlier. His technique improved, but his strategy hauntingly familiar. Michael finally broke free with a reversal that showcased his superior conditioning. But Tony answered with an escape that tied the match at 6-6, heading into the final period. The third period would become the moment that defined both Michael's future and Brandon's past. 6 minutes of pure intensity that would either vindicate 20 years of obsession or destroy what remained of a father's sanity. Michael started on bottom, his face pressed against the mat while Tony's weight settled on his back, and Brandon felt like he was watching his own nightmare unfold in real time. The escape came with a burst of energy that reminded everyone in the arena of a young Brandon Lee, and suddenly the match was tied at 7-7, with 2 minutes left to determine the state champion. What happened next would change everything Brandon thought he knew about winning, losing, and the true meaning of redemption. Michael Lee won the state championship with a perfectly executed takedown in the final 30 seconds, his technique flawless and his celebration muted by the respect he'd learned to show his opponents. As he stood on the top step of the podium, the gold medal heavy around his neck, Brandon felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years: peace. The victory belonged to Michael, earned through his own dedication and talent, not as payment for his father's ancient debt. Tony Castellano had wrestled brilliantly, proving that he was more than just his father's son, and in the handshake line afterward, the two boys had embraced with the kind of sportsmanship that reminded everyone why they'd fallen in love with wrestling in the first place. The drive back to Cedar Falls was quiet, with Michael sleeping in the passenger seat and the championship trophy secured in the back seat like precious cargo. Brandon found himself thinking not about the victory, but about the 20 years he'd spent preparing for a rematch that had never needed to happen. The obsession had cost him relationships, moments with his son, and the simple joy of watching wrestling without the weight of old wounds. But it had also given him something unexpected: the knowledge that redemption couldn't be won on a mat, and that the love of a father should never be conditional on the outcome of a sporting event. 6 months later, Brandon would close the auto shop and take a job as the high school wrestling coach. Not to continue his obsession, but to help other young athletes find their own paths to greatness. Michael would go on to wrestle at the University of Iowa, where he'd learned that college wrestling was an entirely different beast. But he'd face those challenges with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your father believes in you regardless of the outcome. The championship trophy would sit on the mantle in the Lee household, a reminder not of victory over an old enemy, but of the moment when a father finally learned that some battles are won by choosing not to fight them. The rematch Brandon had trained 20 years for would never come, and that, it turned out, was the greatest victory of all.